listener production.
Hey, Bension here. Most of us studied a language in school, and I can count to 10 in Japanese, and not much else as a result. But starting from scratch, learning a language as an adult seems like a huge mountain to climb. And while we do now have apps like Duolingo to help, it's still likely to take a long time and a lot of effort to be anything close to fluent. It usually does help, though, to spend time in a country where everyone speaks it. One team of Australian researchers is testing a way we could be using that fact, but from the comfort of our own home. Brodie McGee is from the University of Southern Queensland. Brodie, welcome to the briefing.
Thanks very much for having me.
Why is it so hard and takes so goddamn long to learn a language?
I think that part of the problem is that the amount of time that we're actually immersed in the language is really difficult. Like, you might go to a community class, you might learn it at university a couple of times a week, but it's so difficult to actually immerse yourself in that language without taking 6 months off of work and going to a different country or surrounding yourself in people from that language. And that opportunity to immerse yourself, I don't know, it's just one of these really difficult things to get into your life, and yet it's the most important thing when learning a language.
You taught languages in classrooms for a long time. When you look back on that kind of traditional approach, how do you view it?
When I finished university and I did my teaching degree, we used to kind of rote learn quite a lot of stuff, or rote teach quite a lot of stuff. You'd get tables of verbs and you'd get just vocabulary lists, and you'd just try and force feed it to people and say, if you remember these words, you're going to speak the language. And we know that that's actually not how language works. I can do a literal translation of a word, and it actually doesn't mean it means that same thing in a different language. Languages, and particularly words, are these living things that change in time, and they really are embodied within these cultures that live and breathe and change and whatever else. And so the transition was to more this idea that actually language is embedded within culture, and we really need to be teaching culture whilst we're teaching words. Words don't exist by themselves. And so when I started teaching languages in schools, we started to try and do this thing that let's get away from the verb tables and let's get away from just vocabulary lists, and actually let's learn about the people who speak this language and the mannerisms that they have and the idioms that they speak with and the different ways that they convey themselves. And even if you think of like English Australian, the idioms, the things that we say here in Australia are so different than what an American might say or what an English person might say. And yet that's where understanding happens. When you actually go to a bar or you go to a cafe and you want to have a conversation with someone, it's those types of things that actually give us common relationships between people. And that's always been missing in the past when we've been trying to teach languages.
It's sort of intuitive that it would be easier to learn a language by going to the place that speaks the language. But in terms of scientific evidence, how do we know that that is better for learning a language?
This doesn't just apply to languages either. If I stick one person in a particular kind of classroom, and then I send another person off, let's say to Spain, and I get them to do an immersion course or something, and then we give them the same kind of tests at the end of that, almost always the person who's doing the immersion course comes out far better off than the person who's struggling to learn this new language in a non-immersive environment. So there are lots of other ways that we can get even more kind of scientific. We can throw people into functional MRIs. We can give them kind of all these different types of learning tests. But at the end of the day, it's about how, in languages particularly, how much they can practically use that language to achieve what they're trying to do. How much can they communicate meaning with particularly people who have grown up speaking that language?
So not all of us can take 6 months off work and go to Spain for the purpose of learning Spanish. Tell us about your study and what it found.
One of the things that I'm really interested in is how do we get that immersiveness if we can't go to that other country? So I used to be a teacher up near Darwin. When I started teaching up there, I had my own VR headsets. I had a small class set that I'd kind of taken up there with me. And the students that I'd taught, the majority of them had never really left the area that I taught in. They'd never left the town. They'd never left the state or the territory, let alone the country. And so when I put the VR headset on them to show them different cultures or different ways of doing things, it completely blew their mind. The idea that, they'd never seen this kind of technology before, but they were getting to experience things, different cultures, different people, even things like the International Space Station. They'd just never been able to see it off of a computer screen. And if you know anything about VR, a good VR headset makes you feel like you're actually there. So that really got me thinking about, well, what actually are the possibilities that we can do with a virtual reality headset? And there is already a huge body of research that really kind of backs up the idea that it could be a good thing for language learning and for learning in general. So one of the things that they have done, other people have done, is whilst people are using a VR headset, they do functional MRIs. And what they do find is that actually when you've got a VR headset on, your brain lights up in an fMRI almost as if you're actually doing the thing. And so if you look at someone in an fMRI learning a language without a VR headset, their brain has certain patterns which are not really conducive of like really good learning. And yet if you put a headset on someone and put them in an fMRI, their brain lights up as if they're actually in that environment, in that immersive environment, as if they'd actually gone over to the country. And so it started me thinking and started my research kind of rolling from there, that if we know that the brain kind of acts as if it's in place when you're using a VR headset, then surely there must be a crossover here with language learning. That if I can trick your brain into thinking that it's in an immersive environment, or really it is in an immersive environment, it's just a digitally created one, then maybe there's going to be better learning outcomes in regards to languages there as well.
So what would it actually look like for someone, for example, trying to learn Spanish for the first time as an adult? They put on a VR headset. What happens?
Yeah, there's two main ways that people are using VR for language learning at the moment. And we have kind of the synchronous and then the asynchronous stuff. So the asynchronous stuff is probably the stuff that we're most used to already. This would be the VR equivalent of apps like Duolingo. There's a really popular one in VR called El Mundo, where essentially there are these apps where you can interact with these bots, where you can go up into a cafe and you can order a coffee and you can order a juice and you can order a croissant. And when you're interacting with these bots, essentially they have a predetermined list of answers and responses, and they might recycle them through. And what you're really doing is that rote learning again. You're just practicing kind of verbatim sentences again and again, which is kind of, it's not a bad thing. You might be able to build up a little bit of confidence. You might be able to do a bit of remembering. I know that when I'm learning my languages and I go into a cafe in the actual country, I get that nervousness of, damn, I'm about to like order something in a different language. I'm going to stuff up. And so it can help people overcome that kind of that fear exposure. There is a place for it. The other side, and really the side that I kind of focused on in my research, was more the synchronous stuff. The idea of actually having real people in real time all over the world put on a headset. And so being able to interact in real time with each other, almost like you're on a Skype call or a Zoom call, but with a VR headset. And so you actually get to see at least a digitally created version of that person. It's essentially a replica of a classroom, but in a virtual space. The beauty here is when I say classroom, it doesn't have to be a classroom like we would think of in a school. That classroom could be the Louvre. That classroom could be a cafe. It could actually be the in-position place, that immersive environment that we're trying to recreate. So we get to decide what a classroom looks like, and we can kind of do these digital excursions and actually put people in much better situations to learn a language.
Many of us have spent a bit of time interacting with ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence chat bots. Is there a version of this sometime soon in the future in which the cafe, the barista, for example, that you go up to is just giving you natural language conversation where you can really feel like you're actually talking to someone that is not someone on the other side of the world, but it is an avatar of an artificial intelligence talking to you?
Yeah, that's right. That's for me kind of the exciting part of this merging of virtual reality and AI. As someone who comes from a humanities background, I'm super wary, I'm super aware of the kind of ethical dilemmas that people are facing around AI. But we also need to acknowledge that there are some really good things coming out of this kind of AI wave. And one of those things that even if you're an OpenAI or a ChatGPT user at the moment, it already has that ability. It's not yet widely put into VR applications, but you can open ChatGPT right now and you can tell it to give you some language lessons in almost any language, and it can do that now in natural voice. And so we're not far away, and I'm almost set that there are companies already working on this where not only will be able to have a natural conversation, but they're probably going to be able to correct you and go, oh, actually, I heard you say this, but I think you meant that. Is that right? And it's going to be able to not just respond to you, but actually help you in the persona of, let's say, the waiter or wherever you are as well. One of my curiosities is, what does an AI really know about a living, changing culture? And I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge in this space in the future.
How long does it generally take for someone to go from nothing to genuinely fluent in a language? And if we use this kind of technology in the near future, do you think that could shorten and significantly, a little bit, lots?
So the question there was, how long does it take you to become genuinely fluent? But my question to throw back would be, well, what does fluent actually look like? Is fluent able to go to a cafe and order a coffee? Or is it to go to a friend's house and be able to converse with their mum over dinner? Or is it to go to the United Nations and be able to translate an official document? Most people, practically speaking, means I could go down the street, I could go into a shop and I could speak and have a conversation and not really be anxious. I would be confident that I could do that. Most people, if they, let's say, did one lesson a week, let's say for an hour and a half, they should be able to get to that level within a year. And that includes full confidence. A lot of people can get there much, much faster, but without full confidence, being able to then practice and actually be like, right, cool, I'm completely fine. I'm okay with this. I've got no anxiety around it. One of the big barriers to language learning is time, but also cost. This idea that every time I go to class, I'm essentially going to have to pay a teacher, whether that's in tuition fees at a university, or if you're going to a community classes, it might be $30 or $40 at a community class. Every time you do that, it's a financial cost as well. While if you purchase a program, let's say on a VR headset, it might cost you $50 or $100 outright, but you can put that headset on your head and you could do that as many times as you want to. You might not want to carry a VR headset on the bus, totally understand that, but you might have half an hour free at home where you don't want to spend the time traveling into the city to go to a community class and then an hour to get home or whatever it might be, but you can throw on a headset for half an hour and do a good bit of practice. And one of the things that we know is not just immersion, but regularity of practice is super important to learning a language as well.
So finally, if this kind of technology is borne out into the future, what might learning a language look like in 5 years?
Yeah, and this is one of the things. I'm a teacher. The use of things like virtual reality or even computers or iPads or whatever the new technology that comes along, these are things that augment or kind of substitute pieces of our learning. You always still need that teacher. One of the big tests in whether this VR AI stuff would work is when you take off that headset and you walk into your classroom and you talk with your teacher in language, has that anxiety disappeared? Have you got the language? Have you got the vocabulary? Have you got the grammar? And that teacher would need to do, or should do at least, that kind of check and balance as you go along. That actually, is this tool working for you? Is this tool the right tool in this situation? For a long time, teachers' roles have been changing from these people who hold all the knowledge to people who facilitate the learning of knowledge. And this is just more on that journey, is that the teachers become facilitators of learning rather than the ones who actually deliver the learning in and of itself.
Well, Brodie, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me.
Researcher and PhD candidate Brodie McGee there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. So is sharing our socials posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.